To live in the United States is to live under a constant rain of weight bias and anti-fat messaging, one that's been pouring down for centuries. And although much of the rest of the world has been caught in the same storm, the global extent of weight bias is relatively new. Until recently, anthropologists working around the world were reporting that fat-negative views weren't common in places like Paraguay and Samoa. And in places where those views were common, they hadn't been widely internalized in ways that led to discrimination or social rejection. So how does culture cause people to internalize weight stigma? And why can believing the moral messages attached to weight stigma be so damaging? To put it simply, anthropology is the study of what makes us human.
So what anthropology brings to the study of weight stigma is understanding how it plays out under different conditions in different societies and different groups within society. And that gives us some clues about what the options are for addressing and managing and reducing and hopefully eliminating weight stigma.
That's Dr. Alex Brewis, a President's Professor at Arizona State University, where she teaches anthropology and global health. Anthropologists like Dr. Brewis, who study obesity and public health, have identified a cycle of how weight stigma perpetuates.
With weight, we see that people, without even thinking, often apply these moral judgments around body weight. So it's things like, people are a very large body because they're lazy, and particularly there's this notion that large bodies represent someone who's a failure in society. One of the things that's particularly pernicious about weight stigma is that it's not only that you feel judged on that basis as a failure by other people, but also that you internalize that and that you start to judge yourself as a failure.
Over time, people on the receiving end of this kind of external stigma come to accept and endorse those derogatory depictions of themselves. That's called weight bias internalization. Once that weight bias becomes part of a person's characterization of themselves, the stigma can, as an anthropologist would say, become embodied and entangled with other parts of their identity that are also stigmatized. One study found that Black and Hispanic women may experience higher levels of weight discrimination and greater psychological consequences than white women because of the multiplying effects of racial bias combined with weight stigma. The study also found that women with the lowest household income suffered greater psychological effects from weight bias than women with the highest household income. The privilege and higher social status afforded by belonging to a certain group had a kind of shielding effect from weight stigma. Why does this happen? Well, it's societal.
Stigma is probably the least visible, least understood driver of health disparities and health inequalities within societies. There's different levels at which we can think about the harm of weight stigma. One of those is in how people feel and how they interact with other people. But we can also think about weight stigma as something that's embedded in our institutions. When you see it embedded in healthcare practices, in educational institutions, in media, that's sometimes what we call structural violence.
Structural violence is a term that describes social structures that stop individuals, groups, and societies from reaching their full potential. Inequities in economic, political, medical, and legal systems can act as roadblocks that have disproportionately negative effects on particular groups and communities. When weight stigma has been so deeply embedded in society, what can people do to fight it?
And one of the real challenges with weight bias is people really don't put the umbrella up or don't have an umbrella at all. So they're constantly being assailed by these negative messages, and it's very, very hard to challenge those and assert against them. And I think a lot of other stigmas, people do have umbrellas that they can put up to protect themselves. So part of that would be support groups or sympathetic clinician, friends and family. And finding some safe spaces that they can be in where they can create identities for themselves that are not based around the stigma.
And putting up umbrellas against weight stigma works. Anthropologists found that women in Samoa and Paraguay who resisted external weight stigma had something in common. They felt more connected to their community. And at the end of the day, society's lack of awareness about its own focus on weight is part of the problem itself.
So weight stigma is not an unsolvable problem. It's a difficult problem because people don't even notice that they're engaged in it, and our institutions are not necessarily being particularly critical about how it's embedded in the way that we do business. But there's a lot of things that can be done.
So next time you notice the dark clouds of weight bias, remember that stigma is not truth. Intervene when someone makes a joke about body size. Help your friend advocate for themselves at the doctor, and question your own anti-fat biases when you catch yourself making judgments about your own or other people's bodies. Take action today and begin a kinder conversation on weight stigma within your community. It might help you and others stay dry from the rain and even change the weather.